He was the most beloved sidekick in Western film history, the grizzled old-timer with the wild beard, the gravel voice, and a heart big enough to fill the open plains. But off-screen, Gabby Hayes was nothing like the character America adored. He was polished, gentle, intelligent, and for decades, he kept one story locked away: the truth about his friendship with the king of the Cowboys, Roy Rogers. This isn't a Hollywood myth. This is the story he waited a lifetime to tell. Before he ever became the gravel-voiced, dusty-hatted sidekick the world adored, George Francis Hayes was far from the rugged frontier persona that would later define him. To understand the man who became Gabby, you have to start in a quiet corner of upstate New York Stannards, a place of soft hills, modest farms, and close-knit community ties. It was here, on May 7th, 1885, that Hayes was born into a life that could not have looked more different from the cinematic Old West. His father, Clark Hayes, he wasn't a rancher or cattleman, but a hotel owner, a respected businessman, whose establishment sat along the local thoroughfare that brought in travelers, merchants, storytellers, and wandering personalities of every sort. His mother, Elizabeth, helped run the household and kept the family grounded in routine, structure, and refinement. The Hayeses were what many would call comfortably middle class, not wealthy, but steady, secure, and far removed from the hardships of frontier life. Growing up around the hotel meant that young George was surrounded by people from everywhere. He watched strangers step in out of the weather and weave tales of their journeys, stories of cities, rivers, trade, and mischief. The lobby, with its constant murmur of voices, was an informal theater. It didn't take long for George to realize that the difference between a dull story and a captivating one was in the telling. And George could tell a story. Even as a young boy, he showed a natural flair for performance. He would mimic guests' accents, dramatic expressions, and exaggerated hand motions. Family friends would recall how he could make adults laugh with just a shrug or a twist of his eyebrows. His humor wasn't slapstick. It was clever, quick, and delivered with impeccable timing. He understood rhythm. He understood silence. He understood how to give a line a moment before delivering it. There was no beard then, no dusty hat, no growl in his voice. George Hayes was actually quite polished, well-spoken, neatly dressed, and surprisingly reserved when not performing. He was sharp-eyed, articulate, and carried himself with quiet confidence. People liked him, he listened, and when he chose to speak, he spoke with thought. But performing wasn't yet a career dream. Like many boys his age, Hayes experimented with different ambitions. For a brief time, he imagined himself a professional baseball player drawn to the energy of the crowd and the camaraderie of the field. Later, he developed an interest in engineering, attracted by the idea of building and creating. None of these paths felt quite right, but the variety of experience would later allow him to slip so convincingly into dozens of roles on screen. Yet the stage, the thrill of imagination meeting audience, was always waiting for him. It began informally, with small local functions and casual gatherings. Then came opportunities to perform more seriously, to entertain not just as a playful pastime, but as something real, something he could pursue. When he met Olive E. Ireland, everything began to click. She saw his talent not as a novelty, but as a calling. Together they formed a vaudeville act, a marriage of creativity and partnership that would shape the rest of their lives. But that part of the story comes later. For now, what matters is this. The seeds of Gabby Hayes were planted not in the Wild West, but in hotel parlors, kitchen tables, and small-town streets. In the laughter of guests passing through his father's lobby. In the stories swapped between travelers. In the quiet confidence formed through a childhood of observation and imitation. He was a storyteller before he ever set foot in Hollywood. Yet nothing in his comfortable upbringing hinted at the grizzled, beloved old-timer the world would one day celebrate. So, how did he get there? To answer that, we have to follow him out of Stannards and onto the road. Before Hollywood ever called his name, George Hayes was already a performer, seasoned by years of bright lights, crowded halls, and the uncertain rhythm of the road. And at the very center of this chapter of his life was one woman, Olive E. Ireland. Olive was not just his wife, she was his creative partner, his manager, his balance, and his greatest believer. Where George brought quick wit and natural timing, Olive brought structure, musicality, and the steady, strategic foresight needed to turn talent into livelihood. Together, they built something that was more than an act. It was a duet of spirits. Their entry into vaudeville, America's pre-Hollywood entertainment machine, was not glamorous. Vaudeville was a grind, a circuit of theaters large and small, from refined opera houses to smoky back rooms where the air smelled of tobacco and spilled beer. Night after night, performers took the stage in a blur of emotion and adrenaline, hoping to earn applause, maybe a booking, maybe just enough to eat. But George and Olive found their rhythm. Their performances blended comedy, character work, light drama, and music, with George often taking on exaggerated personalities that showcased his expressive face and ability to transform himself on command. He learned how to hold silence just long enough to make the audience lean forward and then drop the punchline like a stone. He knew when to move and when to stay still, when to broaden his gestures, and when to scale everything down to a flicker of his eyes. He was learning showmanship, the kind that can't be taught in classrooms. The stage taught George how to read a room and how to own it. He could feel a crowd's breath. He understood the emotional temperature of an audience like a musician tuning by ear. On the road, the couple traveled from one state to the next, sometimes living out of suitcases, boarding houses, train cars, and backstage dressing rooms no bigger than closets. They had nights where applause roared and roses were thrown, and nights where the audience barely looked up from their drinks, but they endured, because the stage was where they lived. For nearly 2 decades, George Hayes became a familiar presence in the vaudeville world. Not the headliner, perhaps not yet, but reliable, consistent, and increasingly respected. His name meant a good night, a laugh, an experience worth the ticket price. And while the road was tough, there was joy in it. George and Olive made memories under marquee lights, celebrating small triumphs, and building a life defined not by stability, but by shared purpose. But fate, as it often does, turned. In 1929, the world shook, the stock market crashed, and the American economy collapsed almost overnight. Vaudeville, which relied entirely on disposable income and entertainment spending, suffered one of the greatest casualties. Shows closed, circuits folded, theater owners vanished. Entire careers evaporated like smoke in cold air. George and Olive were not spared. The savings they had built painfully, slowly, and with great discipline over years on the road were wiped out. The bookings dried up. The circuit they had depended on was collapsing theater by theater. Performers they had known for years were suddenly jobless, drifting, desperate, and frightened of an uncertain future. And George Hayes, bright, quick-witted, and fiercely determined, found himself at a dead end. He was in his mid-40s, an age when most entertainers were considered past their prime, especially in a business obsessed with novelty. The life he and Olive had built was no longer sustainable. The applause had faded, the road had run out, and the spotlight had dimmed. But in the silence that followed, something else stirred. Because when everything falls apart, there are only 2 options: surrender or reinvent. George chose reinvention, and he chose a place where dreams had begun to gather like dust under desert sun, Hollywood. He and Olive packed what they had left and set their sights westward, not for fame, not for glory, but simply for opportunity, for survival, for the chance to begin again. With savings gone and a career collapsing, Hayes faced a crossroads that would change his fate forever. What waited for him in California was uncertain, Yet destiny was already waiting behind the studio gates. He didn't come to Hollywood with a dream of stardom. He came because the road had run out. When George and Olive Hayes arrived in California in the Dawes, early 1930s, they stepped into a city in transition. Silent films were fading, and the new era of talkies was taking over. Audiences wanted voices, presence, personality, and the studios were scrambling to find actors who could bring all three. George had something many studio hopefuls did not. He already knew how to hold an audience. Years of vaudeville timing, improvisation, expression, and instinct accompanied him like tools in a well-worn kit. But Hollywood didn't see a seasoned performer when he first walked onto the lot. They saw a type. His rugged features, wiry frame, and sharp, expressive eyes landed him in small, mostly forgettable roles at first. A villain lurking in a saloon corner, a barkeep polishing glasses while the hero delivered his lines, a town drunk with a muttered insult or a stumbling exit. These were characters who filled the world of the Western but did not shape. And yet, George played each role with precision, treating even a single line as the opportunity to create presence. He watched, he listened, he learned, and he noticed something the studios seemed to miss. The Western was changing. The heroes were brave, bold, polished symbols of American hope, but the stories around them lacked texture, humor, and heart. Audiences wanted adventure, yes, but they also wanted someone to feel with. Someone flawed, familiar, human. Someone who reminded them of their grandfather, the old ranch hand down the road, or the storyteller beside a campfire. George Hayes saw a vacuum, a gap waiting to be filled. So he did what all great performers do. He created a character that didn't exist yet. Piece by piece, he started building the persona that would become Gabby. Not all at once, not by design, but through instinct shaped by experience. The beard came first. It softened his features and made him look older, wiser, and rougher than his polished self. Then came the wardrobe loose. Dusty shirts, worn suspenders, boots that looked like they'd kicked their way across 1,000 miles of prairie. Then came something more difficult, the voice. He lowered it, roughened it, added grit and twang, and painted it with a frontier drawl that sounded like it had been soaked in dust and tobacco. A voice that could growl in frustration, mutter in disbelief, bark in laughter, or deliver a one-liner like a nugget of prairie wisdom. And then, most crucial of all the expressions, the scowl that wasn't truly anger, the eye roll that said, "I've seen every foolish thing a man can do," the jaw jut that meant, "I'm right, and I know it." It was comedy but with warmth. It was rugged but with kindness. He wasn't mocking the frontier, he was celebrating it, and audiences felt it immediately. Soon, those bit roles grew bigger. Directors started giving him more screen time, more jokes, more room to shape the scene. Because even alongside the era's rising cowboy stars, George, now Gabby, did something rare. He made the hero look better. He didn't steal the spotlight. He completed it. Off-screen, however, Gabby Hayes was still very much George Hayes, clean-shaven, articulate, thoughtful, and extraordinarily polite. He read widely. He discussed politics and literature. He dressed with care. It was one of Hollywood's greatest ironies. The most beloved, scruffy, wild-eyed old-timer of the screen was actually one of the most gentlemanly men behind the camera. But the character, as iconic as it was becoming, wasn't yet fully formed. The old-timer had heart, yes. Humor, certainly. Wisdom and grit, absolutely. What he didn't have yet was context. A place to belong. A partner to play off of. Characters don't become legends in isolation. They need contrast, harmony, and narrative balance. And Hollywood had just the figure waiting to complete the picture. A young man with a gentle smile, a steady hand, and the voice of a trail-born troubadour. A hero America would come to. know simply as Roy Rogers. But the character wasn't complete, not until fate paired him with a cowboy hero who would change everything. Before Roy Rogers ever rode into the frame, before the cowboy songs and the golden age popularity, Gabby Hayes' first great cinematic partnership came with another Western legend, Hopalong Cassidy, played by the distinguished, broad-shouldered actor William Boyd. This was the late 1930s, and Westerns were evolving. They were no longer just dusty shootouts or silent horseback chases. They were becoming character dramas, stories of loyalty, justice, camaraderie, and moral triumph played out under endless skies. And George Hayes, now in the regular rotation of Hollywood Western character players, was about to step into a role that would redefine what a sidekick could be, becoming Windy Halliday. The character's name was Windy Halliday, a humorous, wise-talking frontier companion with a rough exterior and a soft core. Windy wasn't the propped-up hero. He didn't draw the fastest gun, and he didn't always win the brawl, but he carried something that audiences recognized immediately: heart. William Boyd's Hopalong Cassidy was strong, noble, stoic, a man of few words and unshakable moral center. But even the greatest hero needs contrast, warmth, humor, and humanity. And that's where Hayes excelled. Windy was the conscience when Hopalong struggled, the humor when tension rose, the wisdom that came wrapped in grumbling, fussing, colorful old frontier sayings, the emotional bridge between the hero and the audience. When Hopalong was the symbol, Windy was the soul. It is no exaggeration to say Hayes changed the narrative structure of Westerns by making the sidekick essential, not optional. The audience responds. Audiences loved Windy Halliday. They wrote to theaters asking, "Where's Windy?" Kids would imitate his lines. Adults recognized him, the old-timer on their porch, the stable hand they grew up with, the neighbor who told good stories and swore he'd seen everything twice. Fan mail poured in, not just for Hopalong, but specifically for Windy. He had become something Hollywood never expected. A character who felt like someone everyone already knew. The Western sidekick archetype existed before him, but he defined it. He didn't simply support the hero. He elevated him. He made the story richer, more human, more lived in, more true. Humor. With purpose, Hayes' performance as Windy was comedic, yes, but not clownish. He knew how to walk the line. Funny, but never foolish. Rugged, but always warm. Grumpy, but never mean. Windy had values. Windy had loyalty. Windy had principles often stated in the most roundabout, hilarious, frontier philosophical way possible. That was Gabby Hayes' genius. He could make you laugh while reminding you who the hero really was. The break a risk that could have ended everything but Hollywood is not a place where loyalty and legacy always count the way audiences wish they did. By 1939, Hayes' contract with Paramount Pictures, in the studio behind the Hopalong Cassidy series, had hit a point of tension. Hayes believed his value on screen had grown. The fan mail proved it. The box office response proved it. The partnership chemistry proved it. But Paramount disagreed. The studio system was rigid. Stars were replaceable. Roles, even successful ones, were treated as studio property, not artistic creations. So, when Hayes asked for a raise fitting his contribution, Paramount said no. Worse, they refused to negotiate. And so, at a turning point, few actors would dare face. Hayes walked away. He walked away from a secure role, a popular character, a major studio, a successful Hollywood identity, and Paramount made sure the break hurt. They kept the rights to the character name, Windy Halliday. The role stayed. But Gabby did not. For most actors, this would have been the end. No character, no studio backing, no guaranteed future. Hollywood is a place that forgets quickly. But George Hayes was no ordinary actor. He was a performer who had survived vaudeville. He had reinvented himself once before. He understood exactly what audiences wanted because he listened to them. A door had closed, perhaps slammed, but another was already opening. At Republic Pictures, a new studio hungry for Western stars, ready to give Hayes not just another role, but a new name, one that would become legendary. Walking away from the role could have ended his career until a new studio handed him a new identity. Sometimes a name doesn't just identify a character. Sometimes a name creates a legacy. When George Hayes left Paramount, he didn't just walk away from a steady paycheck. He walked away from Wendy Halliday, a character beloved by millions. The studio held the rights to the name, and without it, Hayes was essentially forced to start over. But George Hayes had reinvented himself before. He knew what it meant to build something from scratch. And as fate would have it, an opportunity was waiting at a studio, rapidly becoming the powerhouse of B-Westerns, Republic Pictures. Republic didn't have the glamour or prestige of MGM or Warner Brothers, but it had something far more important in the world of Westerns: audience loyalty. Families, ranchers, working-class Americans, people who packed movie houses every Saturday for action, heart, and heroes they could admire. Republic saw what Paramount did not. They knew George Hayes was more than a supporting actor. He was a draw, a presence, a personality that shaped the emotional rhythm of every film he appeared in. So when he joined Republic, the studio simply did the practical and historic thing. They renamed him. The new character's name was Gabby Whitaker. Shorter, friendlier, stickier. A name that sounded like someone you'd want to sit beside at a campfire, listening to stories under the stars. And though the change began as a legal necessity, Gabby Whitaker was more than a replacement for Wendy Halliday. He was an evolution. Where Wendy had been humorous and wise, Gabby was warmer, bolder, more colorful, more alive. He fussed, grumbled, blustered, laughed, warned, scolded, and encouraged with a vibrancy that made him the heartbeat of every scene he entered. And audiences loved him. Why? The persona resonated. Gabby represented something deeply American, something that resonated far beyond cinema screens. He was the old-timer who had seen it all, survived it all, and still had hope in the goodness of others. He was the grandfather figure who remembered how things used to be, the frontier philosopher who delivered wisdom disguised as jokes, the living reminder that courage isn't always loud or shiny. His humor wasn't mockery, it was humanity. His roughness wasn't harsh, it was earned, and his heart, though often covered by a growl or a muttered complaint, was always evident. This wasn't just character acting. This was emotional connection on a national scale. The power of the B-Western circuit. At Republic Pictures, Gabby Hayes flourished in a cinematic world that was uniquely structured for mass impact. The B-Western wasn't expected to be high art, but it was expected to be honest, to entertain, uplift, and inspire ordinary Americans. Tickets were affordable, showings were frequent, and the films traveled from big cities to the smallest rural towns. And in that space, Gabby became a household name. He appeared in more than 40 films for Republic Pictures between 1939 and 1946. Not as filler, not as a side attraction, but as the emotional anchor, the character audiences came to see as much as the cowboy hero himself. Kids imitated his voice. Adults repeated his sayings. Veterans, farmers, and factory workers recognized him as the spirit of endurance and humor that helped them get through their rough days. He was the comic relief that never cheapened the moment, the moral compass who spoke in plain language, the friend on the trail audiences trusted. And yet, this period of success, acclaim, and public love was only the prelude, because at Republic Pictures, Gabby Hayes didn't just gain a new name, he formed the foundations of a partnership that would define Western cinema for an entire generation. A partnership built not on studio contracts but on chemistry, respect, and mutual understanding of what audiences needed most: a hero to believe in and a friend to believe with. The next cowboy who rode into Gabby's life would become one of the biggest Western stars who ever lived. His name was Roy Rogers. Now, the stage was set for one of the greatest Hollywood partnerships of all time. Two men, two worlds, one iconic friendship. That is the simplest way to describe what happened when Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers first shared the screen at Republic Pictures. Yet the truth of their connection runs much deeper than cinematic chemistry. It was a partnership built on instinct, respect, and something far rarer in Hollywood: genuine admiration. The first meeting, Roy Rogers was still a rising star when he crossed paths with Hayes. Young, clean-cut, with a voice that could soften the hardest day and a smile that radiated sincerity, Roy represented a new kind of Western hero. Gentle but strong, humble but unshakable, courageous without arrogance. Gabby, meanwhile, had already lived a lifetime on the stage and screen. He was the seasoned professional, the man with timing refined through decades of performance. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. One a polished musician turned actor, the other a vaudeville craftsman shaped by hardship and reinvention. Yet, when cameras rolled, something clicked. Roy's easy, warm charisma needed grounding, someone who could give him contrast, humor, and emotional depth. Gabby was that grounding force. Gabby's voice was gravel and grit. Roy's was melody. Gabby scowled. Roy smiled. Gabby grumbled his troubles. Roy lifted spirits. On screen, they balanced each other, and audiences felt it instantly. The chemistry that defined a genre. The heart of a Western isn't the gunfights or galloping horses. It's the relationships between the characters riding those trails. And in Roy Rogers' films, that emotional core rested on the interplay between hero and sidekick. Roy was the idealized Western dream, noble, brave, true-hearted. Gabby represented the lived reality: worn boots, dust in the beard, stories carved into the lines of his face. Together, they showed that heroism wasn't only about strength, it was also about loyalty, courage, and the kind of companionship forged through shared miles and shared laughter. Gabby didn't just stand beside Roy, he contextualized him. When Roy faced danger, Gabby's concern made the stakes real. When Roy made a noble choice, Gabby's respect made it meaningful. When Roy sang of home and heart, Gabby's presence made those songs feel earned. Their chemistry wasn't scripted, it was human. Behind the scenes, mutual respect. Hollywood in the 1,930 seconds and 40 seconds could be competitive, cold, and political. Actors fought for screen time, billing, and roles. But not Roy and Gabby. They had something rarer: professional trust. Roy admired Gabby's mastery of performance. He studied his delivery, his pauses, his understanding of how to make a scene breathe. Gabby, in turn, respected Roy's work ethic and his sincere decency. Roy was not a prima donna. He didn't bark orders or demand special treatment. He treated the crew, set workers, and fellow actors, including Gabby, with warmth and equality. Cast and crew often noted their dynamic. On set, Gabby would grouse and joke, keeping the atmosphere light. Roy would respond with that trademark calm grin, a soft laugh, or a quiet comment that somehow kept everyone moving. Together they led without raising their voices. They made sets feel like family, not factories. And then there were the small moments unseen by cameras, unknown to audiences, that revealed just how deep their bond ran. Roy would sometimes bring Gabby a chair or help him down from a horse if he saw the day wearing on him. Gabby would adjust Roy's hat or wardrobe before a take, like a father smoothing a child's collar. During breaks, the two would sit together, not talking about business, but about life, family, music, weather, anything simple and real. It wasn't showmanship, it wasn't performance, it was friendship. Their energies in perfect balance. If Roy was the beacon of the Western, Gabby was the fireplace, warm, familiar, grounding. Roy soared. Gabby kept things close to earth. Roy was hope. Gabby was memory. This pairing reflected something deeply meaningful to American audiences. That strength and tenderness can exist together. That youth needs wisdom, and wisdom needs youth. Their films didn't just entertain, they comforted. In an era marked by economic hardship, war, and uncertainty, the duo represented stability, kindness, and the reassurance that no one faces the trail alone. The question behind the camera audiences saw Roy and Gabby as inseparable, as natural a pairing as horse and saddle. But Hollywood is a place of masks, roles, and carefully staged images, so the question arises, was their bond real once the lights dimmed and the stagecoach rolled to a stop? Did the friendship that audiences cherished endure when the cameras stopped rolling? To understand that, we have to step off the set and into their real lives, into the quiet conversations, the personal reflections, and the legacy of a partnership that shaped the soul of the American Western. But who were they when the cameras stopped rolling? Gabby Hayes was not a man who spoke casually about his colleagues. He had lived long enough, performed long enough, survived long, enough to know that words could either honor a person's truth or cheapen it. Hollywood, for all its glitter, was a town full of rehearsed compliments and politely disguised rivalries. So, Gabby learned early to keep his opinions close. He would tell stories, he would entertain, he would charm, but when someone asked him a personal question, he usually sidestepped it with humor or a gruff one-liner, until the subject was Roy Rogers. When Roy's name came up, Gabby didn't joke, Gabby didn't dodge, Gabby remembered. Admiration rooted in character, not stardom. To Gabby, Roy Rogers was not just a star, not just a leading man with a smile bright enough to light a movie poster. He was, in Gabby's own words, the same man off-screen that he was on it. This was not something Gabby said lightly. Gabby had worked with hundreds of actors, from silent film veterans to rising studio proteges. Some were brilliant, some were difficult, some were kind, and some were merely pretending. But Roy's goodness didn't feel performed, it felt natural. Gabby often observed how Roy treated everyone on set, not just directors or co-stars, but the crew members, whose names rarely appeared on credits. The wrangler who looked after the horses, the lighting technicians sweating in studio heat, the sound crew adjusting wires and mics, the makeup artists fixing dust and sweat during outdoor shoots. Roy knew their names. He asked about their families. He thanked them. He respected people, Gabby once said quietly, and that's the mark of a real star. Shared values beneath the dust and applause. The two men came from vastly different beginnings, Roy from Ohio farmland, Gabby from a New York hotel lobby, but they shared something deeper than background. They shared values. Both men believed in humility, no matter the size of the applause, work ethic, showing up prepared every day. Faith, not in a preachy sense, but in the quiet, guiding way. Loyalty to crew, to character, to audience. Gabby respected that Roy carried himself with grace, not ego. He didn't try to overshadow Gabby or control scenes. He didn't try to make himself look taller, braver, stronger. Roy understood that a great Western was not about the hero alone. It was about the bond between the hero and the world around him, including the grizzled old-timer who always had one more story and one more warning. They were partners, not competitors. Creative disagreements, necessary and respected. That's not to say they always agreed. There were moments quiet, respectful disagreements about tone, dialogue, or emphasis. Gabby often wanted to lean into character, texture, the small gestures, the lived-in humor, the pauses that make a scene breathe. Roy sometimes pushed for pace, especially when musical cues or action timing mattered. Once, during the filming of a dusty trail scene, Gabby wanted to deliver a line slow, with weight, to let the audience feel the miles the characters had traveled. But the studio schedule was tight, and Roy gently reminded him the scene had to move. Gabby didn't snap. Roy didn't insist. They talked. They listened. They found the middle. That was the difference. In Hollywood, disagreements often turned into grudges. But between Gabby and Roy, disagreements turned into better scenes. Late life reflections, the truth comes out. As Gabby grew older and the studio lights began to fade from his career, he rarely spoke publicly about his time in Hollywood. He didn't complain, he didn't boast, he simply remembered. But when interviewers asked about Roy, Gabby's tone shifted, softened, deepened. "Roy was good to me," he would say. "He made me look better than I was." It was a humble thing to say, too humble, if one asked anyone who watched them. But that was Gabby. Even in praise, he leaned toward modesty. Then came the most revealing line he ever gave. "If I had to ride that trail again, I'd want Roy with me. Not as a co-star, not as a character, as a friend." It was clear what audiences had felt was not an illusion of cinema. The laughter, the glances, the shared rhythm, it had been real. But Hollywood is not a place where anything stays untouched. Not friendships, not partnerships, not even legends. Time moves. Studios shift. Careers take new shapes. Health fades. Roles change. And even strong bonds are tested by success, distance, and the relentless turning of the world. They were two men who rode together across screens, but film can't stop time forever. But life in Hollywood changes everything. Fame, fortune, and time always take their toll. When the lights faded, the memories remained. For decades, George "Gabby" Hayes had ridden across the silver screen with laughter, grit, and warm-hearted grumbling. But behind every frame of film, behind every wisecrack and campfire tale, there was someone who had helped build him, steady him, and guide him. Olive E. Ireland, his wife and creative partner of nearly half a century. Their marriage was not loud or dramatic. It did not fill newspaper columns or fuel Hollywood gossip. It was quieter, gentler, a partnership built on shared work, shared road miles, shared rooms in towns they never stayed long enough to remember by name. Olive was his anchor. She was the one who negotiated contracts, packed trunks, scheduled travel, kept finances organized, and offered counsel when he faced professional crossroads. She wasn't just beside him, she was behind him, holding up the world he moved through. So when Olive passed away on the 5th of July, 1957, everything shifted. Gabby had performed roles of loss many times on screen: old-timer farewells, trail deaths, folded hats held over bowed heads. But real grief is not cinematic. It does not resolve in 3 scenes. It settles in the bones. Those who knew him during that period say he softened not in character, for he had always been gentle beneath the gruff exterior, but in presence. There was a quietness in his eyes, a lingering pause before words, a kind of reflective stillness that only comes from knowing that life's greatest blessings cannot be replaced. After Olive's passing, Gabby gradually stepped away from Hollywood. Not in bitterness, not in defeat, but in completion. He had given his career everything. He had traveled the country. He had helped build the mythic West that lived in the hearts of millions. He had played the sidekick to legends and had become one himself. Retreat to the ranch. Gabby found solace in the place where laughter once echoed freely. A small, peaceful ranch in Toluca Lake, tucked into the quiet suburban folds of the San Fernando Valley, a ranch shaded by trees, warmed by sun, and removed from the noise and glitter of the studio world. There he tended to simple routines, feeding birds and stray animals, tinkering with tools in the workshop, sitting on the porch in the late afternoon light, remembering his home was filled with treasures of a life lived fully. old movie posters framed on the walls, letters from fans written in shaky handwriting, photographs of set crews, horses, and dusty filming locations, and of course, publicity stills of him beside Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, and John Wayne. He didn't hang the pictures to boast, he hung them to remember. Gabby would sometimes receive visitors, young actors, old friends, or film historians, hoping to capture his recollections before time took them. He greeted them warmly, offering stories about the early days of Hollywood, stories that were funny and human and marked by an absence of regret. He was not a man haunted by what could have been. He was a man grateful for what was. Reflections on legacy. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, Gabby never mentioned fame or film reels. He spoke instead of children. He remembered how, when he played the sidekick, he was the one children thought they could approach. The cowboy hero was too grand, too shining, too perfect. But Gabby looked like someone who could sit down beside a barn wall and tell a story. Children trusted him. Families loved him. That, he believed, was the real legacy. He once said, "If I made somebody laugh or feel a little less lonely for a while, that's enough for me." It was a remarkably simple measure of a life, and yet a profound one. Grace in aging. As the years passed, Gabby's health began to decline. His steps slowed. His hands shook slightly. But his spirit remained steady. Doctors and nurses would later say he was polite, even in pain. Cheerful, even when tired. Grateful, always. He didn't fear the end. He had lived through eras, stages, characters, reinventions, grief, and triumph. He understood that everything in life, even stardom, has its sunset. But not every sunset is sad. Some sunsets are golden. The memory that never dimmed visitors. Recall that Gabby spoke often of one person during those final years, not about the roles or the accolades or the studio politics, but about Roy Rogers. He spoke of Roy's kindness, his steadiness, his warmth, the laughter they shared on dusty sets heated by sun and long days. The way their partnership felt less like work and more like friendship printed on film. For all the stages Gabby stood on, all the actors he worked beside, it was that partnership that stayed bright, even as everything else grew dim. Even as his body weakened, one memory, one friendship, remained bright. Not the cowboy who rode into the sunset, but the man who left his heart behind. By the late 1960 seconds, time had done what no gunfight, no stampede, and no Hollywood rewrite ever could. It had begun to slow the once tireless Gabby Hayes, the man who had spent decades leaping on and off horses, hollering at heroes, and delivering some of the most memorable comic wisdom in Western film, now moved more gently, more slowly. But the warmth that defined him never faded. When complications from cardiovascular disease worsened, Gabby was admitted to St. Joseph Hospital in Burbank, California. It was a quiet shift, no headlines, no grand announcements, just a man, nearing the end of a long trail, entering a place of care. Hospital staff had no idea a Hollywood legend had arrived, and Gabby never told them. He didn't introduce himself with his film credits or his famous friends. He didn't reminisce unless he was asked. He didn't speak of the business unless someone happened to recognize him. Even then, he would shrug and say, "Oh, I just made a few pictures." But the nurses, orderlies, and attending physicians remembered him for something else entirely. His kindness. They spoke of the warmth in his eyes when he greeted them. The jokes delivered in his unmistakable cadence, softened now, but unmistakably Gabby. The way he thanked every nurse for even the smallest task. How he apologized when they had to adjust his position or draw blood as though he were inconveniencing them. How he never complained, not even when the pain was at its worst. One nurse recalled him saying with a tired smile, "I've had good days, hard days, and dusty days. This one's just another day is all." Even in illness, he carried that frontier humor, that ability to soften the hard edges of life with a gentle grin. His thoughts in those last days. Visitors who sat by his bed near the end say that Gabby didn't speak much about fame or studios or the thousands of people who had seen him on screen. What he spoke of was people. He talked about Olive. He talked about the road. He talked about the early vaudeville days when he and his wife were young, hungry, and hopeful. And he talked about Roy Rogers. Not the icon, not the movie star, but the man. He spoke about Roy's patience on set, about his laughter between takes, about the way he treated the smallest crew member with the same respect he gave the studio head, about how working beside Roy never felt like labor, but like riding with a friend. One visitor recalled Gabby saying quietly, "Roy made the work easy, made the long days feel short. You don't forget men like that." There was no regret in his voice, no longing, just gratitude, simple and genuine. The final moment. On the 9th of February 1969, at the age of 83, Gabby Hayes passed away peacefully. No dramatic last words, no staged farewell, just a quiet departure, held with dignity. It was fitting. The man who played the loud, cranky, unstoppable voice of the frontier had always been, in truth, a gentle soul. He didn't need to ride into the sunset, because his legacy had never been about endings. It had always been about what he left behind: warmth, humor, loyalty, and the companionship that made a hero feel human. His passing marked the end of a life, but not the end of his story. Because some partnerships live on long after the trail has ended. But the story doesn't end with his passing. Some partnerships fade. Theirs became legend. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the frontier sets were torn down, long after the last Saturday matinee screen dimmed, the partnership between Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers continued to live not just in film reels, posters, or memorabilia, but in the hearts of the people who grew up watching them ride side by side across the western landscape of American imagination. For many fans, Roy was the hero they wished they could be: steadfast, brave, and unshakably decent. But Gabby was the companion they felt they already knew. Together, they created something more than entertainment. They created comfort, a reassurance that goodness could still win, friendship could still endure, hard days could still be met with a story, a laugh, or a ride into tomorrow. Their films emerged during some of the most challenging periods in American history: the Great Depression, World War II, and the social shifts of the post-war years. At a time when many families felt uncertainty, their partnership offered stability. Each new picture was a familiar trail, a familiar voice, a familiar bond. The cowboy and the sidekick, a timeless archetype. Before Gabby Hayes, the sidekick was little more than background color, a comic footnote wandering behind the hero. But Gabby changed that forever. He gave the sidekick purpose, personality, heart. He showed that the hero's journey is richer when someone walks beside him. He turned the sidekick into a storytelling cornerstone, a role that would echo for decades across films, radio dramas, Western serials, and later, television. Roy Rogers, meanwhile, embodied the ideal American cowboy not as a hardened gunslinger, but as a man who led with kindness, honesty, and quiet courage. He made heroism gentle, not loud. Together, they reshaped the emotional tone of the Western genre. Not every Western needed to be about violence or vengeance. Some Westerns could be about companionship, trust, and the beauty of simply riding the trail with someone who understood you. This dynamic influenced Gene Autry and Pat Buttram, John Wayne and Walter Brennan, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Butch Cassidy, and The Sundance Kid, and eventually, modern buddy pairings in film and television far beyond the Western. The hero and the sidekick is now one of the most enduring archetypes in global storytelling, and Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers helped define its emotional blueprint. a piece of Americana. Their films became part of what people now call Americana, the patchwork of stories, values, and images that form the cultural memory of the nation. Open skies, campfire nights, a guitar tune drifting through the desert, a wise old-timer with a lesson disguised as a joke, a hero who chooses kindness, not cruelty. These weren't just stories about the West. They were stories about who America wanted to be, why their story still resonates. Even today, whether someone has seen every Roy Rogers film or none at all, the spirit of their partnership still feels familiar. Because their friendship wasn't built on screens, it was built on respect, and respect does not age. In a world that often celebrates individualism, they showed the power of standing beside someone. In a world that frequently rewards ego, they modeled humility. In a world that changes faster than most can keep up with, their story reminds us of the value of loyalty without condition, laughter without ridicule, kindness without motive. Their films may now play on quiet classic channels, in small-town cinemas, or at nostalgia festivals. But every time that dusty trail appears and Gabby's gravelly voice calls out to Roy, something in the heart recognizes it, not as fiction, but as home. Final emotional echo. In the end, their legacy isn't just measured in film counts or box office numbers. It's measured in memories, in the children who grew up watching them, in the families who gathered around small, glowing screens on Saturday afternoons, in the quiet reassurance that goodness, even when simple, is powerful. Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers did not just make westerns. They made friendship visible. They made kindness heroic. They made America believe in its better self. And that, more than anything, is the legacy they left behind.